Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much indeed for joining us for this is our 5th annual Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science lecture. The annual lecture is a highlight in the calendar for us, and we ask often and always very distinguished members of our forensic science and judicial community to speak at those lectures. I'm going to hand over to our principal, Professor Ian Gillespie, now to introduce this year's Leverhulme annual lecture speaker. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Niamh. Thank you, Niamh, and good morning, everyone. This is a lecture that I'm really looking forward to, and as principal, one of the minuses in the role is that one doesn't often get the opportunity to tune in to inspiring speakers. Claude Roux is a really inspiring speaker and a really inspiring scholar. He's made, of course, his own journeys, educated in Lausanne, having been now in Australia, his adopted country, for more than 2 decades, and in just having a conversation with Claude just now, he's got a really interesting accent, actually, which you're all going to enjoy, and very melodic, which I think will be helpful. Claude has really kind of led work in forensic science in Australia, particularly in Sydney at UTS. You can see a nice picture of that behind him when he comes on the screen. But as well as being a really distinguished scholar and a leader in forensic science in his country, and a leader in forensic science as an academic discipline, and indeed a leader in pulling in really extensive financial support, I think one of the things that's particularly exciting for me to hear from Claude is his understanding of some of the challenges around forensic science and the difficulties of forensic science as a discipline in ensuring that the outcomes and the insight of that discipline are used effectively in the judicial system, and the interaction between the judicial system and forensic science as a strong academic discipline. And he's going to share some thoughts and some experience with us, particularly around the Sydney Declaration, looking at the scientific foundation of forensic science and how that's helped deliver effective outcomes into judicial considerations. It's one that's of particular interest to Niamh and to our own Leverhulme Centre. So without further ado, it is my huge privilege and pleasure to introduce Claude Roux. Claude, over to you.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much, Ian, for the very kind introduction, and thank you for for the invitation, and thank you to Niamh and everyone at Leverhulme and Dundee for this invitation. As a way of introduction, I would say we had a very close relationship with the Leverhulme Centre, because like Leverhulme, we have a Centre for Forensic Science at UTS. So we've been with Leverhulme pretty much right from the inception, and even before that. I've known Niamh and a lot of people for so many years. So we were there in the early days, and we've been very impressed, by the level of impact in the development and changes in research and research culture in forensic science that Niamh and her team are doing. So it's great to see that sort of research and that sort of interaction, and I'm very proud to collaborate with the Leverhulme Centre. From there, I would just say I'm very pleased to make this presentation. So I hope people will find it interesting. It's something very close to my heart, and it's been simmering for so many years. And you'll see with this presentation, it's I'm not going to claim that as my work at all. It's really a collective work from a lot of very good thinkers, and some people are even better thinkers than me. So without further ado, I will try to share my screen. So I hope it's okay. Let me know if it's not okay. So the presentation today is called Strengthening Forensic Science by Understanding Its Fundamental Principles, the example of the Sydney Declaration. So as I mentioned, it's really a collaborative work, and you have here the names of everyone who collaborated for this kind of outcome. And you will recognize some very well-known names in forensic science, very good thinkers, as I mentioned, but also a few people who are Leverhulme Center fellows, so affiliated with the Leverhulme Center. So, for example, in addition to Neve, we have Keith Inman, we've got Sheila Willis, and Alistair Ross. So it's a great testament again to what Leverhulme is doing. So, forensic science crisis. So we've heard for so many years that forensic science has been some kind of crisis. It's almost like a big crossroads or gridlock that we can't get out of it. We've heard a lot of statements saying that we had problems. We need to urgently improve the reliability and quality of forensic science. We need more resources, obviously. We had this famous NAS report in the US and later the PCAST report. They primarily focused on issues such as backlogs, like in DNA analysis, and the risk of errors, especially in pattern comparisons. Now, while the original crisis has been addressed, or at least partly resolved, it also appears that many real or perceived problems within the community are persistent. And we can see that through a number of papers, over the years. So I have a few examples here. It's by no way exhaustive, but it's quite clear that there is still a lot of debate about forensic science, what it is, what's the value of forensic science, where do we have challenges, how reliable is it, in court, how valuable is it for investigation or other things, and even a paper like this one, even asking the question whether we are in danger of extinction. Now, it's fair to say that a lot of this debate has focused, as I mentioned, on backlogs, errors, bias, question of accreditation, questions of reliability, efficiency, and so on. We've got all the buzzwords here. Very few questions arose, or very few papers really discussed more fundamental questions around the purpose of forensic science. What's our purpose? Why do we do what we do? And what is the science of forensic science? What are the foundations of forensic science? These are more more difficult questions, maybe more philosophical questions sometimes, and unfortunately they are not addressed or considered, at least not as often as the others about backlogs, errors, and so on. Oops, what's going on? Sorry about that. I will present now a few anomalies, because it's quite interesting to see when we talk about these problems in forensic science that actually we are in a very strange world, because, for example, we know several studies have shown that between only 10 to 20% of the materials recovered at the scene are sent to a lab. And then only 5% of materials examined by the lab end up in court. Then we've got a lot of studies, especially in criminology, which have questioned the effectiveness of forensic science. And really, the answer is not that clear. At least there is a modest impact, but it's not as clear as we would like to see. We can argue these numbers, but it gives you a bit of a ballpark figure. Now, this is quite interesting, because on one hand, if we hear all the time that we are in crisis because we are not reliable, we have all these issues of errors, and we have a lot of miscarriage of justice because of forensic science. How is it possible when we see these numbers? How can forensic science have such a dramatic role in miscarriage of justice? So that's a quite interesting anomaly, if you want, or paradox that we can immediately see. Another one I'd like to raise here, and it's the best example to illustrate this, is to use this paper by Carl in York, who was a head of a forensic service in a police force in Sydney, and she presented a case, a completely hypothetical case, but it shows the sort of continuum we are in forensic science, and that forensic science really doesn't start at in the lab. So it's a case of an elderly woman coming back home and saying that she's been broken into and a lot of goods are missing. So she describes everything and she goes on. The scene may or may not be disturbed. When she calls the police, she may or may not have some kind of advice from the police reporter. The police may or may not attend, or they may or may not, give some priority to the case. Then they may or may not collect physical evidence. I'm using the term here. They determine whether or not a crime scene examiner attends. They may or may not brief the crime scene examiner about the case. Once the crime scene examiner is there, there may be some things like fingerprint, for example, but it's based on what they may or may not have been informed. They will make a decision about what traces sent to the laboratory or may not send to the laboratory, and the analysis may be done quickly or not, and they may give results or not. So you get the picture. We are in a very uncertain continuum. The beginning of the case, especially the incident generating traces, it's heavily context-based and it's not controlled at all. While what's very well controlled is what we see in the middle of the continuum, which is especially the lab analysis and when results are provided by experts. But then we get to the other end of the spectrum, where actually, again, it's less controlled from a forensic science perspective, where the forensic scientists find themselves in a very uncomfortable place called the court. And again, it's not very well controlled from a scientific basis. So it's the thing which is interesting here in terms of anomaly or paradox. We've seen a push in recent years for a lot of search for systematic errors, control of uncertainties in testing labs, controls of experts, focus on methods. Well, actually, all this is what's happening in the middle bit of the continuum, which is already well managed and well mastered. And the two extremes, which are not very well controlled, actually it's where we have most of the uncertainties. So again, it's an interesting anomaly. I could continue like that for a long time, talking about anomalies or paradox in forensic science. Another one which is quite obvious is there is always a very strong focus on evidence in court, while at the same time we know that where we can have a huge impact in forensic science is the early stages of the case, especially in investigation, and fewer and fewer cases end up in court. So we have this sort of inversion of things. So there is a philosopher of science who showed that essentially we can't really put a paradigm against another one. So we can only understand one paradigm through the conceptual framework and terminology of another rival paradigm when actually these anomalies lead to a situation of crisis. So in the beginning, we think that if something doesn't fit a paradigm, simply it's an outlier. But when these anomalies become way too important, it leads to a crisis, and then a new paradigm starts to emerge. So I think it's important to have these sort of discussions, because for a very long time, We've seen forensic science in terms of organization, in terms of means, tools, and processes. How can we improve the means? How can we improve the tools, processes? Rather than thinking about our forensic science as a discipline that has a purpose. And if we have a purpose, we need some objects, or at least one object of interest. So that leads to, I have no idea why it does that. That leads to this big realization that was already mentioned or identified by Paul Kirk in 1963, where essentially, we really need to think carefully about the fundamentals of our discipline. And it's time really to provide this fundamental perspective. And why is it important? It's because we are a kind of a rather smaller community compared to a lot of very well-established disciplines. And each time people came to forensic science from a specialty angle, they looked at forensic science through their own prism. So we had first analytical chemistry, then technology industry, quality industry, and so on. They all came, and I'm not saying they don't play a very important role in forensic science, but they always looked at what we are doing from through their own prism rather than through the prism of forensic science. And we are a bit like this small guy on this seesaw. Very quickly we are tilted because we are not as big, as well established as these other disciplines. And it's important for us to develop our own principles, to recognize them, because very simply, how can we know what to teach and what to research and how to practice if we don't know our discipline and its fundamental principles? So let's have a look a bit at forensic science and the forensic science objectives. Broadly speaking, there are three broad objectives. One which is about investigation. It's by and large, there is a big role for the police as an organization at that stage of the process. And here it's interesting because a trace at that stage of the process may be useful to reconstruct things, but maybe not that useful to identify a suspect or, beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's a different type of situation compared to when we move to another type of purpose, which is the justice purpose, which is at the trial stage, where here really we want to bring useful information to either a convict or exonerate a suspect. So here in that case, for example, a finger mark would be could be better than a shoe mark, while a shoe mark may be better if, for reconstruction. There is a third dimension or third objective for forensic science, which is a more recent, which is the intelligence purpose of forensic science or objective. It's mainly aiming at crime prevention and improvement of procedures through the analysis of not one case, but all reported cases to better understand crime or security pattern or phenomena. So, we're in the COVID world now. So it's like in the COVID world, we're not, interested in the single case anymore. People are more interested to see all the COVID cases, how they move, and how the whole phenomenon is occurring, and then trying to impact on prevention or disruption or future decisions that can help the authorities. So the interesting thing at this stage is, given these multiple forensic objectives, and knowing that we have a lot of different models, a lot of different countries, a lot of different legal systems, it's very difficult to find the common element between all that. Is it the scene? I mean, the scene is very crucial. We can understand that, it's absolutely crucial to forensic science. But we can see some forensic cases where there is a very clear scene sometimes. definitely not the legal framework. I mean, we know I've been working in the inquisitorial system. I've been working in the adversarial system. So it's very difficult, again, to have something completely common. Definitely not the techniques, because traces are quite diverse. So a microscope may be useful for something. It may be completely, it can't do anything for another type of traces. And the questions are probably something very important, probably the most important of all, because we are using forensic science to attempt to answer these questions, these famous questions. But again, they are very varied. And then we realize that the central common point that we use to try to answer these questions, pretty much across all the different models, all the different judicial systems, it's essentially this famous trace, this trace that is the remnant of a presence or activity. So immediately this trace, it could be anything. It can be physical, it can be virtual, it can be very small, it can be very big, it can be transient, like an odor, for example, and so on. As long as you can examine, record some features for this trace and interpret that trace, attempting to answer the questions that are being developed. So here on this slide that was provided by Professor Margot for a previous conference about the Sydney Declaration, when we launched the Sydney Declaration, I won't go through all the details, but quite clearly we see that, we've got this generation of traces, which is again a matter, pattern, or signal, and these traces are only recognized after a certain time. So already we see that time has, plays a role here, and these traces are used to develop hypotheses, and through that cycle we can attempt to reconstruct what happened. We can make association with other material or other people that can lead to identification of or even individualization of some possible source. So we can see these traces can really speak, and they are the proxy of the event that actually happened. But they must be examined, and really importantly, they must be interpreted. So with all these discussions over the years, and because a few of us thought that it would be probably time to discuss a bit further and try to identify what we think the principles of forensic science are, and what we think forensic science is all about. So here you've got the names of these people that really we collaborated very well for almost 2 years. It's been a very organic and iterative process, and I'm sure that we can even improve what we've done. But I think it's a very good start, at least to put the narrative out there, and really try to move the discipline further on very solid fundamental principles. So first, a definition. So we can hear sometimes that forensic science is the application of science and technology in a legal system, but it doesn't say much. It doesn't tell about the object of the study, the object of concern, and so on. Here you've got a full definition that we came up with, that forensic science is a case-based or multi-case-based research-oriented endeavour using the principles of science to study or understand traces, the remnants of past activity, such as an individual's presence and actions, through their detection, recognition, examination, and interpretation, to understand anomalous events of public interest. So really here, the very important word is case-based. The context is something which is impossible to dissociate from forensic science and from the traces. It's science. It's definitely, we need to do what we do using principles of science. Traces, so these are the object of the study, the examination. And these traces have to be detected, they have to be recognized, amongst a very heavy background of a lot of non-relevant material, they need to be examined and interpreted. And then we identify a series of 7 principles. So I'm going to read these principles each time with a few explanation. The first is that saying that activity and presence produce traces that are fundamental vectors of information. So here it says the precondition for forensic science investigation is that activities cannot occur without leaving traces. Sometimes they are left at the scene, sometimes they are taken away. The nature and the activity influences the types of items that are exchanged and how and where they are dispersed in the environment. This item or items are a remnant of the investigated activity. It's the trace. The trace is the vector of information that is capable of being detected, examined, and interpreted. And the traceability of human activity is rapidly changing in our digitalized world. And the place of forensic science is therefore increasingly central to studying events of public interest, which are themselves in transformation. So obviously, it's really expanding from the famous locales exchange principle that you see here on this slide, fully translated. So much more than just every contact leaves a trace. The second principle is really highlighting the scene and the need for science at the scene. So it says the goal of the scientific investigation at the scene is to infer, which means reasoning under uncertainty, the reconstruction of an event through the study of the surviving traces. The site of an event is where relevant traces can be recognized and characterized with respect to their relative position that may be indicative of sequence, orientation, and interaction. This information combines to help understand a limited number of potential explanations relative to the traces that need further examination and interpretation in the reconstruction and identification processes. This complexity requires a trained mind with broad science knowledge and with powerful and proficient observation and detection skills that may be extended by various scientific tools. So here again, very important to realize that, we deal with these traces, we deal with natural laws, we need scientific expertise, and it's not a simple mechanical process. Sometimes we hear the term administrative objectivity. So saying that if we are very careful with the chain of custody, we are a good crime scene examiner, we realize that it's much more than that. And it's all about integrating crime scene management within scientific scrutiny. The third principle, it's about the logics and the reasoning that is being developed in forensic science, and here it's very interesting to see that when we look at the questions and the trace that we use to answer these questions, again we see this continuum that we have from the scene to the trial of fact. But interestingly, we never go straight to the proof, and we start from these traces, which are marked, or can be sometimes called trifle or symptoms in medicine. And there is some kind of hierarchy here, because we don't go straight from mark to proof. So there is a whole process where we go through sign, which is essentially a trace that means something, and then clue, which is when the trace can lead the investigation somewhere. And immediately we can understand that there are a lot of different types of reasoning and logics that are being used through that process. And again, it's heavily case-based. It needs a very strong trace ontology, and again, it needs to know really what we can say and how it is understood when we're at the other end in court. And it's much more, really much more than just some control checklist, pill factory type examination, or quality assurance that has been mostly borrowed from the laboratory industry itself, borrowed from manufacturing industry. So there is much more to it, much more to the logical reasoning and investigative methodology that we are using. Something which is interesting here is that we've got this development and crystallization of hypotheses through retrodiction and abduction. So really at the beginning of the process, especially at the scene, we've got a maximum entropy. It's a big mess. It's very difficult to formalize, and it's more a qualitative approach. And essentially, we just try to find essentially in the beginning, the best guess. So we look at the results. So we look at the traces, trying to infer potential causes. And again, taking the analogy with COVID, we know that you may have a very bad cough. It may mean different things, not necessarily COVID. So by definition, it's the name of the game when we do that sort of logic, like abduction, that there are always more one potential cause to what you observe. But once the hypothesis is developed or even accepted, then other corroborative traces are looked for through induction. And then very quickly, we see the whole system becoming a hypothetical deductive process to eventually essentially becoming a deductive process at the trial. So when we get to the other end here, we try to be in a situation with minimum entropy where it's easier to formalize and it's more quantitative. So at that stage, it's a more rhetoric reconstruction associating the causes to the traces. At that stage, it's important to note that some authors, and I'm part of that team who's proclaiming that sort of a theory or that sort of message, that forensic science actually is an anti-Galilean science, because we reconstruct a single event, and also it does this through traces that are specimens that are produced. They are one-off. They are produced in non-controlled manner, and they've been selectively and purposely collected. It hasn't been statistically sampled or controlled sample. So it's a very interesting scientific discipline. The fourth principle is that forensic science is an assessment of findings in context due to time asymmetry. And here really it says that in many instances, the quality of the trace resulting from an activity is such that it is incomplete, imperfect, and or degraded by the passing of time, with such losses increasing uncertainty and often supporting only approximation concerning the past event under investigation. The ground truth remains in the past and is largely inaccessible. Forensic science can only be used to construct a model that is descriptive of a given scenario, explained by what is observed. The context is therefore essential. This is not a general model, but a specific retrodictive model that can only be inferential in nature. Forensic scientists cannot determine which certainty the definitive circumstances surrounding a trace, but only assess the relative value of associated findings under different plausible causes of scenarios. Such assessment should be unbiased and founded on scientific rigor or transparency. So this is what we see with this figure here. And the ground truth remains inaccessible. And the challenges here is really to recognize the traces for what they are and what they can tell us about the event of interest. And the best way to illustrate this is to take to adapt an old figure from Stuart Kind, where this is pretty much what you could observe at a crime scene. Again, a lot of different traces, marks. You can see tire marks, you can see shoe marks, you can see some even bird feet marks, different things. When you do hindsight, which is always a great thing. So this is the reality. This is the ground truth that you never know. It started like that. There was a bit of it looks like bird feet marks here, and these are the relevant traces we are looking for. These are these are shoe marks, but with the time passing, we've got other marks coming and being added. But when we are here, we don't know. We have to essentially sort out that situation. And we have this big challenge because we've got this time asymmetry. Without going into detail, I mean, what's very interesting here, it's the Alvarez hypothesis. And it's the big question was why dinosaurs did disappear. And there was a lot of different types of hypotheses, including a pandemic, including volcano activity. So without going into too much detail, here the idea is that traces were there, they just had to be recognized. And the traces were essentially in a crater in Mexico. There were some traces of a high level of iridium in some geological phases, which corresponds to 66 million years ago. And there was also some shocked quartz that was there. And by combining these two traces, then and going through this hypothetical deductive process, the well-accepted hypothesis that now we have is that actually a big meteorite impacted the Earth and then created some kind of a nuclear winter for many years, and the dinosaurs didn't survive. And here it's the Alvarez scientist, so its father and son who got a Nobel Prize for that. So the thing to understand is that at that stage, so is that the experimental scientists try to address the issue of underdetermination of the future by testing false positives and false negatives. And they try to confirm or refute the hypothesis. And while historical scientists, they exploit the overdetermination of the past by searching for a smoking gun to discriminate amongst competing hypotheses. So here the problem is to try to recognize the traces for what they represent. And the thing to remember, one method is not superior to the other. They are simply different. It's not that one is a better science than another. And it's something important to realize because in essence, forensic science is a historical science for that reason. The fifth principle is that forensic science deals with a continuum of uncertainties. So these uncertainties are present at every step of the process. That starts with the generation of traces and moves through all the steps up to the communication of the findings and value to the intended recipient, whether it's reported in written documents or in oral form, such as a presentation in court. Research is needed to identify and quantify these uncertainties with the knowledge that uncertainty will never be eliminated. It's a very important point. It will never be eliminated. So this is a figure that Neve presented at the launch of the Senior Declaration. And really it shows very well that some traces are here, but maybe they are here for very innocent reasons, very legitimate reasons. And once they've been transferred or they've been generated, there is always this time that is passing before it's discovered and going through the whole process. And here there are a lot of opportunities for the traces to be contaminated. So again, a lot of uncertainties. And again, when it's presented in court, I mentioned before, it's where rhetoric meets science, and obviously there are always a lot of uncertainty between what we think we say and what people have heard. The sixth principle is that forensic science has multidimensional purposes and contributions. It's quite interesting. There is the last decade, we could see that essentially forensic science or forensic scientists could become more privileged observers, because by looking at forensic traces, which are the proxy of the event that happened, when you look at a lot of these traces, and you look at a lot of events, sometimes there are some repetitions, and you can decipher some interesting phenomena. And by doing that, you bring knowledge on crime, on illicit markets, on various mechanisms that cause harm or are a concern to society. And essentially, you are doing an intelligence work. And because of that, we realized that really there are different purposes and contribution to forensic science, or forensic science. So the first one is really, I would say, the most common one is when we try to use forensic science to lead to legal characterizations. So essentially here we use a framework about law, rules, proceedings, and the interpretation is all about the evaluation of the traces or evaluation of evidence. This is well known. It's a very common type of purpose for forensic science. The second one, which is also well known, it's to do with using forensic science for investigations, and especially criminal investigation. And here the interpretation, it's all around the investigative process. And the third one, which is the one I highlighted just before, it's where we try to generate knowledge. We try to generate knowledge, and it's the framework we use. It's about crime intelligence, it's about security, proactive policing, study of crime, so essentially criminology. And for the interpretation, we use an integrative process. So the first two are really, so 2 and 3, the most common ones are reactive, while the one about intelligence and knowledge, it's proactive. And now the 7th principle, which is the last, be happy to know. And it says forensic science findings acquire meaning in context. And here it says that forensic scientists need to act ethically and with impartiality, transparency, and independence to ensure that they remain true to their science, and so that the information they provide for the potential resolution of the activity under investigation is useful and reliable, regardless of who benefits from the information. Forensic scientists must defend their results and opinions as appropriate, while acknowledging any plausible alternatives. When evaluating findings, at least 2 alternative propositions should be considered. This is a very important principle. And I acknowledge this fantastic slide, a combination of 2 slides from Sheila Willis when we had the launch of the principles of the Sydney Declaration, really highlighting the fact that ethics is absolutely vital. Ethics is vital also when we interpret our findings. And Sheila made a very strong point. I'll take again to you now, that if we don't interpret the findings and we just give a pure analytical results, actually we act unethically, because this may be misleading. So that's a very important thing. And again, trying to highlight again this case-based nature of forensic science. So it's important to know about things like discriminating power and limitations of the methods and so on, because the more we know that, the more potentially useful the evidence is. But ultimately, it's not completely useful if we don't interpret in the context and don't realize that everything we do is case and context dependent. So the Sydney Declaration, in the really crude summary, or a very one slide if you want, it's really a definition and 7 principles. And the 7 principles, really, one is about highlighting traces, what they are. One is about scene investigation. One is about highlighting the case-based nature of forensic science that relies on scientific knowledge, the investigative methodology, and logical reasoning. The 4th one is an assessment in context due to time asymmetry, really highlighting this problem of time asymmetry and again context. Another one is about acknowledging the uncertainties that are there. We can't remove them, but we just have to try to understand them and express them better. It's about the multidimensional purposes of forensic science. That's another principle. And the last principle is about being ethical impartial, transparent, and independent. This declaration really, to me, and I hope to many people, is not focused on an organization or technicalities or protocols. It's a try to provide a shared understanding of forensic science and its principles. We hope that it leads to a more impactful and long-lasting effect as it guides education, training, R&D, and practice, and also foster the development of a forensic science culture instead of primarily technological culture. And that culture is unified by purpose and principles rather than means. So in summary, it's try to better define forensic science purposes and principles so that can be shared and hence transcend organizations, processes, and sub-disciplines. And ultimately, we can provide a solid and transversal basis to guide future improvements that are probably, or we hope, more than, better than or more long-lasting than solutions tried to date. So that's what we're trying to do with the declaration. Now it's publicly available. If you want to see the full event, it was a 2-hour event, virtual event. You've got the URL here, and please go to the recording and you'll see really the whole event, which is very, very interesting. And I think it's work in progress, but we hope that it was a really major stepping stone. I'm not finished. I don't know whether it does that now. In conclusion, so I've got some perspective about the future, and I think this presentation, convinced you that there is a need to refocus the debate on forensic science purposes instead of the means and the processes. It's very, very important. Otherwise, it means we haven't moved since 1963 and Kirk's quote, really. We need to better develop and promote fundamental forensic science principles and knowledge, and we need to better design and implement risk management that is fit for purpose. We're not a pill factory. We are not a pill testing factory in forensic science. There is much more to it, and we need to better express and promote a proper forensic science culture, and we can only develop that culture if we understand our principles, if we understand what we are doing, what it's all about. And to enable these changes, it starts by education. We need to educate the forensic scientists of the future. We need to train existing forensic scientists, and it's an ongoing, really an ongoing process. It's about R&D. And about collaborations. Collaborations are absolutely crucial, and it's why I'm always excited to collaborate with the University of Dundee and Neve and her team. So here you have a kind of a figure showing a crude, illustration of how forensic science is seen in a very traditional way, where it's a lot about standards, a lot about bias, law, and so on, and then quickly it's separated in a number of disciplines or sub-disciplines and silos, and maybe in the future, something that we should try to go towards is something like that, where we've got forensic science at the core, with forensic science fundamentals at the core, and then that can branch out to some traditional or less traditional forensic science disciplines. Standards, tools, methods, the legal system and all that are very important, but they are part of the framework. They are not really at the core of it when we think about what forensic science is all about. So I'd like to thank a lot of people. So thank you for listening, and I really apologize for the little glitch with my computer. And I'd like to thank the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science, University of Dundee, for the invitation, especially Professor Niamh Nic Daid, all the colleagues and friends who contributed to the Sydney Declaration, You know, it's definitely a teamwork, and it's been fantastic working and discussing, very exciting discussion with all this group. And I know that you know, it's not finished, so it's a great journey. I'd like to thank Professor Céline Weilman from the University of Lausanne, because a couple of the slides I used, we presented together at a conference in Korea. If you've got a few questions, you can contact me by email. You've got a website, even Twitter nowadays. And yeah, don't forget, the declaration was under the auspices of the International Association of Forensic Science, because we're hoping to do that in September last year, then in May this year, and now in November 2023. So hopefully, with the massive vaccine rollouts we see in a lot of countries, hopefully we'll be able to meet face to face at the end of November in Sydney, and we'll be able to talk about all these exciting topics about forensic science. So thank you very much. I suspect I just stopped sharing.
Super. Claude, thank you so very much indeed for that absolutely fascinating presentation. And I think it really is a testament to the whole team that you've brought together, cajoling us all to work together so well to produce the Sydney Declaration. There's a couple of questions I see come in, but I'll start us off with one, while encouraging others in the attendees to please post a question in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up in the short while that we have left. So I suppose to start us off, my question would be, where do we go from here? What's next for the Sydney Declaration? What are the next steps that are in the plan?
So the next step, I mean, first, just to make sure that all the audience, all the listeners understand that we had this big virtual event. So we had more than 1,100 people registering for that event. So there was a huge interest, and I think the feedback we had on about that, people were very excited, and they really by and large liked it. But it's only the start. We don't want to stop there. So the next step is to publish a paper based on that declaration. So it's work in progress. So that will, put the declaration essentially, as a very strong, robust academic paper. So hopefully it can make an impact. Then we will invite feedback, obviously. We're very interested to know what people think about that declaration. We plan to have a special issue of a forensic science journal, where we'll go a bit more in depth on some of the topics, some of the principles. We'll invite people to present, to publish papers, papers in favor and papers against the declaration. I think it's important to have a bit of broad view about what's going on, and then we'll do several refinement, and the aim is to get to IAFS 2023 in Sydney at a time where we'll be able to reaffirm the declaration, maybe in a revised version, and have people really trying to buy into the declaration in a more substantial way.
Super. That's a very ambitious, but I think it shows just a fabulous forward momentum, which I think is going to be really exciting, I think, for all of us to be involved with. I'm going to turn to some of the particular questions in the Q&A, and I'll start with a question from Peter Maskell, who asked, do you consider investigations of unexplained deaths to be covered under the definition of forensic science?
The investigation of unexplained death. I mean, if you've got, if you've got traces in the broad terms of the definition that can be used to investigate unexplained death, I mean, definitely. It's one type of investigation.
Super. Yeah, I agree entirely. Another question: how does the investigation and intelligence phases work across each other? Can they compete with each other in a case? And is there a difference in respect to the scientific robustness between the two? There's a bundle of questions in there.
So investigation and intelligence. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And I think I have probably to make a disclaimer here, because I think there is intelligence mean different things to different people and means different things to different countries or jurisdiction, or even cultures, depending what kind of professional cultures you are part in. I know that quite often in police circles, intelligence is used as a different level of proof. So, you know, if you have a finger mark and you may not have enough minutiae, but you can already do something with it. You know, some people say this is intelligence. I mean, to me, the difference is if it's still with a single case and not a multi-case situation, it's investigation. When you are starting to look at traces from a combination of cases, then you are really talking about intelligence. So it's sometimes easier to see the distinction when we look at the health system, and especially again looking at COVID. When you look at only one case, so if if it's just looking at symptoms and trying to understand and identify the medical conditions, so this is like an investigation. When you have a lot of cases showing the very similar symptoms, and then you identify a cluster, all these magic words we hear all the time, then that's the equivalent of intelligence. So it's more epidemiology, if you want. Now, what was the second part of the
second part
question?
Was, is there a difference in respect to the scientific robustness between the two?
Scientific robustness, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there may be some differences in the uncertainties, in the risk that people are going to be willing to take. So obviously, with intelligence, we know that a lot of the hypotheses are not going to be true. So you have to accept, a higher degree of risk and false, false information, if you want, that essentially will inform the the decision maker. While in investigation, obviously, you want to tighten that up. You are not going to charge someone if you don't have a higher level. So you will take a lesser risk, in terms of where you put your threshold. And then obviously when you go to court, then it's an extra step, the type of magnitude.
Yeah. There's more questions than we have time to answer, so I'm going to pick and choose a little bit, folks. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to pick one about education from Anna Vignol. You mentioned education for forensic scientists. What, in your view, are the challenges in cross-disciplinary training, particularly crossing boundaries such as statistics, physical science, and social science?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's a question. It's a challenge we are facing with all the time. So it's kind of the, at what stage you are too far and you are too much in terms of being jack of all trades but master of none, or you are still at a level where you can touch to a lot of, or teach a lot of different topics or disciplines and still keep something coherent. I think that's an interesting challenge. Look, my view, and I'm a bit biased, I'll declare straight away, because having I studied in Lausanne, I came with a very strong view that forensic science is the discipline, and we have this sort of reversed triangle, if you want, where we are educated in forensic science about these various fundamental principles. We have enough science knowledge to be able to use our science to examine traces as much as we can, but that the specialization comes second. While a lot of universities will focus very quickly to a specialty and very detailed, very detailed questions and specialization, and then if you do that, you don't have enough time really to cover all these principles and so on. So it's a good analogy with medical training. You start by doing the GP training and then you specialized, and I think that would be the kind of analogy that I would like to see more and more. But I'm conscious that there is a big challenge with funding, I guess, funding framework or formula we are in different universities. It dictates what kind of subject or units you can teach. I don't think there is one size fits all, really. But I think a general education in forensic science is an excellent baseline.
Yeah. Jumping back to crime scenes, what about crime scenes involving digital evidence using the second principle that you mentioned, where the scene, so in this case, where the scene can be online or in cyberspace and across different legal boundaries? Will the second principle, how do we implement it in that kind of scenario?
So it's more about the tools that we would use to examine the crime scene. Yeah. So look, I think there is no doubt that the digital transformation of society are completely changing the game. Before talking about the tools being used for crime scene, it would be very interesting to talk about what it did for for our everyday life, so our behavior. So hence a lot of things that we used to do, and we're well placed to know now with COVID, used to do physically or in the physical world, now we do in the virtual world. But it doesn't mean that we don't leave traces, and actually we leave many more traces in many more different forms. And the pace of the collection of these traces, it's enormous compared to the physical traces. So that creates quite interesting challenges for forensic science. But I think that's a different question to what's being asked, which is about if we could use digital to help addressing crime scene or examining crime scene. And look, yes, I mean, if it's I remember Keith Inman in the European Academy of Forensic Science in The Hague talking about the crime scene of the future. It was forensic science of the future, so it's back to the future with crime scene, and talking about drones and things like that, new ways to examine crime scenes. And I mean, if it helps, definitely. But having said that, again, this is again tools. So we won't be able to exploit that to the right level if we don't realize that we need really to apply the correct scientific principles and fundamental principles of forensic science.
Absolutely. A couple of more, I think, where we just have time for it. There's a couple linked to standards and accreditation, and one that says go one back. What is your view on using ISO standards at the crime scene? Will they be used to prevent people thinking outside of the box and using deduction because there is no SOP for this? And a follow-on that says, do you think forensic pathologists and post-mortems should be covered by ISO standards as well? Oh, I picked those questions up correctly.
Okay, so it's two different questions. I mean, the first question about the ISO standards, yeah, I mean, it's a very good comment, and I tend to agree. We have to be very careful when we develop standards that we don't limit ourselves to use the proper critical thinking that may go outside the box of the standards. So I guess it's all that is in the art of the, I guess, of the writing of the standards. I guess my comment about standards, really the problem is, by and large, a lot of the standards have been developed originally for analytical laboratories and adapted to forensic science. And in addition, the original standards from analytical laboratories were essentially borrowed from the manufacturing industry many years ago. So it's a completely different setup and framework to what we have in forensic science. So that kind of work, for lab activities, even though, but the problem is when we start talking about, the two other ends of the continuum and talking about digital. I mean, quality assurance in digital forensic science, it's a very challenging topics. Methods change all the time. Who is using these sort of tools? It's used outside a lab framework, outside any accreditation. Does it mean that we shouldn't be using these sort of digital traces? No, because I mean, sometimes you can crack a very important case using these traces. So it's quite exciting.
It is, absolutely. And I note Jill Tully, thank you, Jill, for your comment. The previous forensic science regulator has put in a comment on the Q&A about the implementation of standards as well. Thanks very much indeed, Jill, for that comment. I'm going to do two more questions, and then I'm going to do my thanks. I think, Heather, you'll keep me right if I'm doing this out of sequence, and then there'll be a final video that plays for the centre. But Claude, an opportunity for you to wrap up any of the other questions that you may wish to answer in the Q&A itself. But just to kind of finish out this part, there was a question in particular, which is, how do you expect the global forensic science community to act on the Sydney Declaration, and what has been the feedback so far?
Okay, look, I mean, expectations, probably with two expectations. I mean, one direct, if it makes people think about what they are doing in forensic science, if they stop for just a little moment and think carefully about what is it all about? What have I been doing this GCMS analysis for 20 years? And then really try to see a bit, how it could be used, probably better or with more effectiveness, and also be able to have a good critical thinking about this whole big mist, not to say mess, about this crisis, and trying to sort, what the real relevant challenges are and what's the noise. And that's probably not easy. So, I mean, it would be great if people can do that. Then the other expectations, but I have no expectation really, but it would be great if it could have an impact, a long-lasting impact, as I mentioned, about on forensic science, because it goes across the subdisciplines, it goes across all the different models and so on. So it's a way to transcend the world we are in forensic science, instead of creating more silos and more rules. I guess I'll just make just one little comment. When we had the idea of the Sydney Declaration, it was really with the idea that we would have the meeting in September last year. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking about the Nurem Declaration, which is a famous declaration in the fingerprint world, when in the early 90s in Nurem, a group of fingerprint scientists and experts met and had declaration. Essentially, I paraphrase, don't quote me on the actual words, but essentially saying that there is no scientific value to the numerical standards for fingerprint identification. And at that stage, it was probably very controversial and pretty much almost science fiction. It took many years, in some countries up to more than 10 to 20 years to make the change, but it enabled the change. So the idea here was a bit the same thing. We declare what we think forensic science is all about, what our fundamental principles are, and to some extent maybe people will disagree to start with, but hopefully generate that debate, and slowly people will realize that there was something interesting in it. Or at least it's what we hope.
It is indeed, and certainly at the Leverhulme Centre we're very proud to be part of this adventure. And Claude, it remains for me really to thank you so much. I know it's quite late over in Sydney now at this evening, but thank you very much indeed after a long day's work to come and to present our annual lecture for us. And to do it in such a fantastic way and provide such an engaging and really thought-provoking presentation. I think that is obvious from the list of questions. It remains for me to thank a few people and to give a vote of thanks. Firstly to our principal and the senior officers of the university who have been incredibly supportive of the Leverhulme Centre over the last 5 years of our existence. We're in the halfway mark now. And in particular to Ian Gillespie, our principal, who introduced you and has now had to leave the call. I'm also, of course, hugely indebted to the Leverhulme Trust, who are our funders and who provide us with just an amazing resource to really be able to take such an agile approach to enabling research within the domains across forensic science, but also to look at, as you described very well, those two ends of the process from the crime scene and the courtroom. To thank all of our stakeholders. We have over the last 5 years worked with literally hundreds of practitioners across the whole gamut of the crime scene investigation through to all of the disciplines in forensic science, and most importantly, dealing directly with our senior judiciary and getting their view on where our challenges lie. And I'm indebted to everybody who gets involved with us and answers our call when we come asking for information and for their input into the work that we do. We have an advisory board and a governance board, and of course I need also to thank them for all of the support that they have provided to me and to the wider Leverhulme team, and indeed to every single one of the staff and the researchers within the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science for the critically important work that they do, and for the good humour with which we all engage with our work and work together in that interdisciplinary space, which is both a challenge and a blessing, I think. We're going to leave you with a short video of just a little capture of the public engagement work that we do. And my final vote of thanks goes to Dr. Heather Doran, who's our public engagement manager, who really has embedded public engagement in every aspect of the Leverhulme Centre's work and brings not just our stakeholders in to speak with us, but also brings absolutely the members of the public through our citizens jury and other activities. So it's a short video of just how we do that public engagement aspect of our work. Claude, a pleasure as always. You'll have a few moments left while we show the video to answer any of the remaining questions, but we can certainly get those questions to you also. I think a most stimulating talk, the beginning of a new journey for us all in looking at revitalizing what we mean as forensic scientists, forensic science is. So again, thank you everybody for coming. Claude, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. And Heather, over to you to roll the video.
The Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science puts public engagement at the heart of our work. Since the Centre was established in 2016, we've worked closely with members of the judiciary, forensic science practitioners, law enforcement, industry and the public to define and refine our research focus and aims. Our research work spans 5 thematic pillars of detection, recognition, comparison, interpretation, evaluation, and communication. Our focus comes directly from our strategic conversations, where we bring together our stakeholders and the public to define key areas of need in forensic science and generate new ideas. These discussions create our research projects. In 2019, we were awarded a Gold Award from the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement in recognition of our commitment and focus to public engagement work across the centre. People are involved in our work from the creation to the end. We have created a citizens' jury with members of the public, launched public citizen science activities, science communication comics, immersive games, and worked with partners such as Dundee Women's Festival, the Dundee Science Centre, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and many more, covering topics including transfer, persistence, and evaluation of different evidence types, such as DNA, fibres, footwear, and fingerprints. We also lead and participate regularly in national and international conversations about forensic science. This engagement work changes our approaches to research to be truly collaborative with our end user and practitioner communities. Our public engagement has supported our aims to revise the current forensic science ecosystem and to raise the scientific robustness where it is needed of some of the current forensic science used in our courts, to communicate forensic science correctly and appropriately, and to identify new opportunities that will improve the value of forensic science in the criminal justice system.